Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not an American, and this means that I don't see things quite in the same way as many others who've been speaking on this platform this morning. But I think what I have to say very much follows on from what Martha Farah has just said, and is perhaps a different way of saying the same thing. In her highly influential book, Neurophilosophy, Patricia Churchland recommends that we ask ourselves just what philosophy has to contribute to our understanding of human mental processes, just what that is compared to neuroscience. The answer is not much, or even nothing at all, depending on your level of exasperation. Churchland is of the view that philosophical arguments about our existing concepts, the concepts of folk psychology, as she calls them, are of no real significance. It's not just that these arguments are merely verbal, it's that they ignore the fact that our folk concepts belong to a theory, a useful theory, and one that gives us a handle on human language and behaviour, but a theory nevertheless. And theories get replaced by better ones. That, she tells us, is what is happening as neuroscience takes over from folk psychology, providing better explanations of human behaviour than could ever be obtained from that old-fashioned language of belief, perception, emotion, and desire. Now, it's over 20 years since Churchland's book was published, and in the wake of it, whole disciplines have sprung into being, proudly sporting the prefix neuro by way of attaching themselves to Churchland's banner. Philosophers like Dan Dennett and Stephen Stitch have strengthened Churchland's argument, which was, to say the least, weak when it came to addressing the problems caused by self-consciousness and intentionality. And several of them, Dennett in particular, have tried to incorporate the outlook of neurophilosophy into a comprehensive vision of the human organism of the kind popularized by Richard Dawkins. We have entered a new period in which philosophy, among a substantial community of its adepts, is seen as the handmaiden of neuroscience, whose role is to remove the obstacles that have laid in the path of scientific advance by popular prejudice and superstitious ways of thinking. Now, it's worth reminding ourselves, and I've got through the first four of those items in a wonderful speed, it's worth reminding us that we have been here before. It was Locke who described philosophy as the handmaiden of the sciences. And for Locke, science had achieved a paradigm of excellence in Newtonian mechanics and in the laws of motion which seemed to explain the emergence of each state of the universe from its predecessor. The major problem for philosophy, as Locke saw it, was to clear the way for a comparable science of the mind, one that would deliver the laws of motion that could explain one mental event in terms of its predecessor. His theory of ideas and of the laws governing the relation between ideas was intended as a first step towards such a science of the mind. And it was enormously influential, being taken up and applied by Berkeley, Hutcheson, Keynes, Addison, and Hume, each of whom assumed that human mental processes consist in the generation, agglomeration, association, and recognition of subjective items, sometimes distinguished, as by Hume, into impressions and ideas, but all conceived as non-spatial, non-physical particulars, obedient to causal laws of their own. Now, it's fair to say, it's fair to say that Hume's theory of the human mind contributes nothing to his deeper philosophical purpose, which was to justify the ways of common sense against the wild speculations of the theologians. Not only is the theory without empirical foundation, its principal theoretical items, impressions and ideas, are neither publicly observable nor describable in extensional language. As a science, the Humean theory of the mind is a non-starter, and the same goes for the theories of Locke, Berkeley, and all their 18th century successors. What we learn from Hume about the mind, we learn in spite of the science, and not because of it. And maybe there is no better proof than Hume that philosophy has something to say to us, which science cannot, or at any rate does not say, something which survives the refutation of whatever science it is used to put forward. Now, it goes without saying that the science advocated by Patricia Churchland is better in every way than that assumed by Hume. If we are to look for causal explanations of human behavior, then undoubtedly neurology, backed up by evolutionary psychology and cognitive science, is the way to go. But does this mean that there will one day be no questions about the human mind left over for philosophy to answer? And does it mean that any current attempt to give a philosophical account of mental processes is merely a presumptuous anticipation of science? Surely neither of those conclusions follow. They would follow only if all coherent questions about human nature and conduct were scientific questions concerning the laws governing cause and effect. And I think Martha Farah has already given us reasons to doubt that. Very few questions that we habitually raise concerning human nature and conduct are about causes. Most of our questions are about interpretation. What did he mean by that? What did her words imply? What does this gesture express? What is signified by the hand of Michelangelo's David? Should he be blamed for her death? One task for philosophy is to give an account of human nature which will show the centrality of those questions in our lives. What makes it true that we are interpreting and interpreted creatures? And what have we built upon the practice of interpretation? One obstacle that has been placed in the path of neuroscience by philosophers is the claim that human actions are understood in terms of their reasons, not in terms of causes, and that this endows them with a status that cannot be adequately captured by an empirical science, since the proper explanation of a human action is not a causal explanation. Churchland rightly answers that there is nothing in the idea of a reason that prevents us from giving causal explanations of the processes to which it is applied. On the contrary, rational connections might be part of causal explanations. For instance, the laws of arithmetic, which state purely abstract relations of proof and deducibility, are part of the explanations of the calculator, which is a machine so designed that it carries out calculations which conform to those laws. We likewise are creatures so designed, or rather so adapted, that our behavior conforms on the whole to abstract relations of rationality, probability, and reasonableness, and that we have a grasp of those relations and are able to use them to influence each other's conduct. So far, so good, but does this not suggest that there might, after all, be a feature of the human mind that stands in need of a philosophical and not a scientific explanation? Calculators are designed to obey the laws of arithmetic, but they do not justify the laws of arithmetic, nor do they tell us what numbers are. Those are philosophical tasks which have occupied the greatest philosophical minds from Plato onwards. Human beings have adapted to the demands of reason and make use of those demands in influencing each other's behavior. And those facts admit of a scientific explanation. But the science in question will not justify the demands of reason, nor will it give an account of how human beings themselves must see each other if they are to recognize the force of reason and act in accordance with it. This last point is illustrated by the problem of free will. Neuroscience assumes that human beings are organisms whose neural pathways conform to the abstract principles of reasonableness, in the way that computer circuits conform to abstract principles of mathematics. Knowing these pathways and how they function, we can predict from some given situational input the normal behavioral output. At no point in this explanation need we use concepts of folk psychology, such as belief or desire, nor can we attribute to the organism some metaphysical condition of free will, which breaks the chain of causality precisely at the point that needs explaining. But that's not the whole truth of the whole story. There's a story that emerges from the mouths of the organisms involved. And these stories are byproducts of the process of decision-making, but not descriptions of it. Words such as I put up there, like I, choose, responsible, Martha Farah has already referred to some of these words, have no part in neurological science, which can explain why an organism utters those words, but can give no material content to them. Indeed, it seems to me that one of the recurrent mistakes in neuroscience is the mistake of looking for the reference of such words, seeking the place in the brain where the self resides, or the material correlate of human freedom. All such ideas disappear from the science of human behavior once we see human behavior as the product of a digitally organized nervous system. But the ideas of the self and freedom cannot disappear from the minds of the human subjects themselves. Their behavior towards each other is mediated by the belief in freedom, in selfhood, in the knowledge that I am I and you are you, and that each of us is a center of free and responsible action. Out of these beliefs arises the whole world of interpersonal responses, and it is from the relations established between us that our own self-conception derives. It would seem to follow that we have an existential need to clarify the concepts of the self, of free choice, of responsibility, and so on, if we are to have a clear conception of what we are. And no amount of neuroscience is going to help us to clarify these concepts. We live on the surface, and what matters to us are not the invisible nervous systems which explain how people work, but the visible appearances to which we respond when we respond to them as people. It is these appearances that we interpret, and upon our interpretation we build responses which must in turn be interpreted by those to whom they are directed. Now, here's a useful parallel here in the study of pictures. I hope this is clear enough. It is fairly obvious that Titian's famous painting of the Venus of Urbino consists of a canvas on which are distributed pigments. We could describe this distribution using geometrical coordinates in two-dimensional space, and so pixelize Titian's picture in a digital formula that enables a machine to reproduce it. This formula makes no mention of the woman, her servant, no mention of the eyes which challenge and the hand which hides, and which caused Mark Twain to denounce this picture as obscene. Yet it contains all the information necessary to produce an image in which those things are seen by someone who has the capacity to understand pictures. We could imagine animals who were adept at recognizing the distribution of pixels and could selectively respond to every difference between patterns of pigments that we see as pictures, but who nevertheless did not see pictures. And of course, we are familiar with the digital programs which record, transmit, and present pixelated images in machines which see nothing at all. That is what is going on now before your eyes. Now, the normal response to this kind of example is to say that pictorial images are emergent features of the things that possess them. The picture of the young lady of Urbino is not something over and above the coloured patches in which we see it, but it is not reducible to them either. I have to take away that pleasant slide and replace it with a boring one. But it is the picture is a feature of the painting that emerges for those with the imaginative powers required to perceive it, but which can be produced simply by producing the right distribution of coloured patches. Someone might be an expert in producing copies of the Titian, even though he is blind to its subject matter and sees it only as a distribution of pigments on a canvas. Now, maybe something similar should be said of the human person, namely that his being a person with free will, rationality, and self-consciousness is an emergent feature of the organism in which he is, so to speak, planted. It is not something over and above the neurological mechanism which generates the behavior that we interpret in personal terms, but it is not reducible to that mechanism either. Someone might be an expert in explaining and understanding the mechanism while being person blind. He might be unable to treat others as accountable beings and have no sense of his own accountability towards them. He might not see others as centers of selfhood and narrative consciousness, and see himself only as an organism animated by appetites. Such a creature may be very adept at predicting how others will react. He might welcome neuroscience as a refined addition to the art of exploiting the living corpses by which he finds himself surrounded. But his world contains no persons. Now, I think that is a conceivable possibility, and it is indeed an extreme case of a disorder which, alas, exists all around us in milder forms. If, however, we think there is such a thing as understanding persons, that this understanding is fundamental to our lives, and that it stands to neuroscience roughly as the understanding of pictures stands to the chemistry of pigments, then we might begin to be a little sceptical towards the claims made by Churchland and others on behalf of neurophilosophy. We might think that there is a use for philosophy in clarifying the domain of interpersonal responses that cannot be preempted by a science of the human being, not even a science that looks as promising as neurology. And we might also think that when much that passes for science among the neuro enthusiasts is shown not to be science at all, still the task of philosophy in understanding our predicament as persons will remain unaltered, as it was unaltered by the refutation of Locke's theory of ideas. Such, at any rate, would be the intellectually healthy response to the advance of neuroscience. But it is not the response that we see. On the contrary, the zeitgeist, which is an entity that has no neural network to uphold it, has taken up the cause of Patricia Churchland, and instead of looking for the areas of human thought that are independent of neuroscience, has used neuroscience, or at any rate the promise of it, to invade all neighbouring disciplines and to cancel their claims to independence. And I suspect that Professor Bennett earlier was reacting against this. So we now have not only neurophilosophy, neurotechnology, and neuroethics, to which terms we can, I think, attribute a relatively unproblematic sense, but also neuroaesthetics, with its own journal, under the auspices of Samir Zeki, neurotheology, neurolaw, promoted by a huge grant from the MacArthur Foundation, neuroart history, with a book by John Onions, neuromusicology, and so on, all advancing towards what Zach Lynch has eulogized as the neurosociety, in which neuroscience will replace all our old ways of dealing with human beings and their problems, and at last put us in full control of our future. When I read this stuff, I long for the return of David Hume, and for someone who will defend the claims of ordinary humanity against what pretends to be science, but is in fact the wildest form of theology. The example of the picture is useful to us in defending intellectual territory from the neuro-imperialists. It is certain that there is much to be said about Titian's painting in terms of the disposition of pigments on a two-dimensional matrix, but it will not amount to an interpretation of the painting and will tell us nothing about the significance or value. For it will not mention the most important fact about the painting, which is what it is about. Now, the word about is notorious. It is the very same word that causes all those difficulties about mental states and their analysis, which were held at one stage, wrongly, to present an immovable obstacle to any simple physical analysis. Pictures have intentionality, to use the technical philosophical word, just like beliefs and desires. They are about things, and the things that they are about don't have to exist, or if they do exist, they don't have to be as the picture represents them to be. And they can be compared in respect of their intentional content, not only with other paintings, but with works of literature and works of music. There's an interesting question. Let's see if we can go back to... there is an interesting question of whether Titian's painting is to be understood as the expression of a domestic and nuptial sexuality, such as occurs between man and wife, or whether the young lady is to be seen more as a courtesan than a wife. You know, that's a really interesting question, and how would you answer it? And there's an interesting comparison to be made here with a painting that explicitly refers to Titian, the famous Olympia by Manet, in which the rough trade of the boulevard is put in ironical relation to the soft, downy embraces of Renaissance Venice. Interpretation starts here in comparative judgment, and it is hard to see what neuroscience can contribute to the result. Pictures are understood by finding their meaning and by assessing the place of that meaning in the life of the observer and what it conveys about the human condition. And you are likely to gain insight into Manet's painting if you set it side by side with some of the literature of the time, Daudet's Sappho and Zola's Nana, for example. You understand what Manet is saying better if you see Titian's world ironically reflected in the forms and props that surround this hard-bitten whore. Now, art critics have a discipline, and it is one that involves reasoning and judgment. It is not a science, and what it describes forms no part of the physical world, which does not contain Olympia or anything else that you see in this painting. And that's a very important point. Yet someone who thought that art criticism is therefore deficient and ought to be replaced by the study of pigments is surely missing the point. There are forms of human understanding which can be neither reduced to science nor enhanced by it. Here is where the neuro-thugs step in, to declare that, of course, the science of pixels won't explain pictures, since pictures are in the eye of the beholder. But there is also such a thing as the MRI of the beholder, and this does contain the secret of the image in the frame. Since understanding a picture is a matter of seeing it in a certain way, in such a way as to grasp its visual aspect and the meaning which that aspect has for beings like us, then we should be understanding the neural pathways involved in seeing aspects, seeing pictures, and the connections which link those pathways to judgments of meaning. But what exactly would such a study show? Suppose we have achieved a perfect decipherment of the pathways involved in seeing an aspect and in stabilizing it in the mind of the observer. This is not a judgment of criticism, and while it might enable us to predict that the normal observer will, on confronting Manet's picture, see a naked woman lying on a couch and looking at him, it will say nothing in answer to the critic who says, yes, a normal person will see it that way, but that is not all that there is. And if you go back to our original picture, the critic might say, you must see that this woman is not naked at all, but rather unclothed, which is a completely different condition, that her body has the texture and the movement of the clothes she has removed, and that those eyes do not look at you, but look through you, dreaming of someone else. Now, critics, in other words, don't tell us how we do, with normal equipment, see things, but how we ought to see them. And their account of the meaning of a picture is also a recommendation which we obey by making a free choice of our own. All this by way of saying that the neuroscience remains only a science. It cannot rise to the level of what I call intentional understanding, where meaning is created through our own voluntary acts. Hence, we should not be surprised at the dreariness of neuroaesthetics. I recommend you to have a look at the Journal of Neuroaesthetics and see if you can get through more than 2 pages, and its inability to cast light on the nature or meaning of works of art. I give the example because I think we can work back from it to the problem that bothered Churchland. Just as there is an understanding of art which forms the domain of criticism and which is a rational exercise with its own standard of validity, so there is an understanding of people which forms the domain of interpersonal relations and which is a rational exercise obedient to norms of its own. And just as it is an error to think you can replace art criticism with the neuroscience that allegedly explains the phenomena with which it deals, so too is it an error to think that you can replace interpersonal understanding with the neuroscience that allegedly explains our behavior. If you try to do this, you end up describing the behavior in terms that remove it from the context that gives it sense. You become a reductionist, in other words, someone who fails to see that the most important features of the human condition are emergent features, which inhabit the surface of the world, but are invisible to those whose eyes are fixed on the depths. Thank you.